Good morning, everyone, and I'm happy to be here as a part of this presentation. So, what I prepared to speak to you all today is really about visibility and validation when it comes to specifically the best practices around data sprawl and the way in which InfoSec and privacy risk has to be a part of how we enable that type of data to satisfy our core business requirements, to enable the effectiveness of how that data is used in the example that John presented. And I'm going to be speaking about some of the things that I myself, as a solutions engineer, I end up speaking to customers, individuals, businesses, entities, and I help advise on ways in which where they can actually take this opportunity and bring it to the next level while incorporating that information privacy risk perspective. So today's agenda for this session today is going to be on how things have changed with regard to data and security. I'm going to be able to showcase how cross-functional challenges can be combined with certain cross-functional initiatives to really enable that transformation. And then I'm going to be speaking about the steps to protect that relevant information. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So today's data landscape. This is one of the most interesting aspects of the 21st century way of doing business, is that we now are in an environment in which where just the velocity of data is unprecedented. What we're seeing when it comes to customers or individuals who are engaged in either business to consumer relationships or business to business relationships is that all of those transactions and interactions are constantly generating information, data. And similarly, like our own data practices at home, we may not be going through our phones and deleting all of those weird or strange looking photos we don't want to keep. Instead, we pay for additional storage, whether it's through Google or through Apple and iCloud. And now what we have is this massive amount of data that we're now generating more than we have the capacity to be able to make sense of. So speaking about some direct metrics, the velocity. 2.5 quintillion bytes of data was created every day in 2020 alone. And that was as we were trying to transition over to a virtual environment. We can't even imagine how much data is being generated, even on a day-to-day basis or a minute-per-minute basis. And we see those projections increasing every year. And then we have 200, as many zeros as you can see there. That's 200 zettabytes, for those who are wondering. That type of data will be stored in the cloud by 2025. So if we're looking at the amount of data that we're dealing with now, previously, as I've engaged with other customers, or in my experience as an enterprise data steward, manually reviewing that data is not going to be an option anymore. We have to be able to recognize technologies and strategies that will help us make sense of this data, because what we are now seeing is an increase in variety of that data as well. So we're creating this data at an unprecedented rate. We're now storing this data through various clouds, various data centers, whether they're on-prem, they may be legacy, or they may be off-site. And now we have a variety of different data elements. Most importantly, with the advent of the creation of technology, we can now see that any individual's information, it wasn't just first name, last name, email that we have to worry about being stored in many different environments. Sometimes there's biometric data. With Face ID, we can now have the capacity to store relevant information about someone's facial characteristics. AI and machine learning can now develop profiles on individuals, so that way it's no longer just, hey, Phil Jonaus, he loves Formula One, or he loves watching the US Open and loves playing tennis. It's now, he now is also as interested in buying a brand new bicycle, or he's now also interested in going to the Miami Grand Prix at some point. So this type of information, while not inherently sensitive, can now enable business to do a lot more with that data. But now we're going to see some challenges for when it comes to the privacy regulations that govern how you can use that data. And if this didn't sound complicated and difficult already, the attack surface of all of this information is going to expand. So as we continue to store this information, we have to recognize that data is an asset in which there are going to be bad actors looking to take advantage of it. One of the common things that we see from the tenets of master data management is that data is an asset, and similar to as cash as an asset, similar to buildings as an asset. With data, you can generate revenue for many different customers, and without it, your ability to generate revenue decreases, or sometimes for some businesses disappears entirely. One of our customers solely relies on that data as being the lifeblood for how their entire business model is put together. And we're seeing that newer creations or newer business initiatives, newer industries are relying on that data. And even the older industries where you may see manufacturing, chemical plants, they're increasingly being more reliant on that data as well. So stealing and being able to access that data is one of the major risks for that. So it's going to be our responsibility to protect that type of information. Furthermore, we're now looking at a decentralization of all that information. So we're at the stage in which where data can and needs to exist in various different data centers for your consumers, for your customers, for your employees to be able to access that information readily. So multiple copies of that data may need to exist in multiple places, which makes it more difficult to manage. And while our infrastructure and IT capabilities have been able to rise to meet that challenge, the problem is now there's an onus on chief data officers, on data engineers, data analysts to be able to keep track of that information so that it doesn't become a shadow IT resource. And again, not to sound doomsday-ish, but there are new privacy and data security regulations that are introduced on a near monthly basis. Only just recently, as a privacy professional, we now are able to research Iowa's incoming privacy law. So one of the things that we see from that perspective is we've seen California, Utah, Colorado, Virginia, to name a few states in the United States, where we are actually seeing privacy laws going live this year. It wasn't just GDPR, it wasn't just California anymore. We're now seeing these many different jurisdictions independent of these larger systems implementing their own new privacy practices. And what we're now starting to see is enforcement of those privacy frameworks are now increasing. California specifically, when we're looking at their recent enforcements of businesses when it comes to selling or sharing data, when it comes to this not being able to report on how data is utilized, not obtaining consent from individuals. So we see that as being another risk factor we're going to have to pay attention to, especially when we are engaging or utilizing data. And now finally, one of the most difficult and sort of where I had my footing in my career is the data footprint has exploded now with redundant and duplicate and siloed data. Because it becomes difficult to be able to maintain all of this information, sometimes in the transition from on-prem to cloud, from data center, or from cloud to another hosting provider, we end up leaving data behind. And we may not recognize its value until we recognize, hey, we're missing this. And when we have that data footprint that is now ever increasing, again, the surface of the exposure for a business for what type of data they have, it just becomes a very, very difficult thing. It becomes more from being able to manage a bucket to now of data to now managing a pool of data. It's no longer data lakes. I hear from my customers, they're speaking about data oceans, in which where similarly to our own ocean, we've barely explored just the surface of what is there. So when it comes to this persistent and overwhelming threat, we finally have the last thing, which is to the brand. We know that enforcements can cause damage in brand reputation. So this is one of the things that we need to be aware of as we engage in all of these different data practices, in our data initiatives. When we are trying to enable data for the good of the organization, we need to recognize that this is still a reflection of the business, and there may be some ethical guidelines that need to be taken into consideration. So the industry is facing a lot of these challenges. So we can speak about the way that doing business with data is evolving, but I think everyone here is aware of sort of the ways that your day-to-day lives may be impacted by that. Before, data was owned by the enterprise, in which were personal data specific to individuals. It was easy. If you collected that data, it was yours. You didn't have to worry about any regulations. You had the right to do whatever you wanted with that data. Now what we see with the posture of privacy regulations from both GDPR to CPRA is that data is now owned by the individual, which means you have to be considerate of the desires of specific individuals, such as your employees, those consumers, your contractors, your third parties who engage with you. You now want to be able to make sure that you're respecting how their data is used. And you need to be able to track how that data is used. So adding a layer of complexity to that, think about trying to make sure that a drop in the ocean is being properly routed, whether you have currents leading data to feed specific AI machine learning algorithms, or if you have data elements that are used to send targeted ads. We have to be able to track and recognize how that data is being utilized, because the individual wants to know before they engage with you. The individual now has the right to opt out at any point in time as part of that process. And now the individual now has the right to say, you know what, just forget me altogether. So the way that we're doing business with data is evolving, and for better or for worse, it's now a challenge that we see being put on CDOs to have to sort of make sense of all of that.
Phil, a couple of questions coming in, and I think it's a good break point. Most recent, Phil, what are your thoughts on managing privacy and data security and the impact it has on initiatives and analytics?
Absolutely. So what we're going to talk about actually very next is that privacy and security and all of these initiatives have to run together. They have to run from a central point of understanding, and that may come from the CDO, that may come from the data privacy officer, but it may come from general counsel. But the goal is you need to now, in order for you to best make sense of all of this information, is you need to be able to break down the silos that currently exist within those organizations. So when it comes to privacy initiatives, you need to not only have the visibility of what the regulation is, of what legal guidance you have from your own counsel, but you also need to have the understanding that there is an opportunity to enable that data for the purposes of data analytics. There's the opportunity to now implement certain security controls for that data from IT risk management. And now there's an opportunity to better report on that.
So to expand that question, I have an added question to that is, we ride the line between innovation and actually preventing innovation, right?
Exactly. Yes.
In my opening, I mentioned that example about the smart cities and the automobiles. One of the challenges there is privacy issues.
Yes.
In fact, that smart city had all sorts of challenges because the information they were getting from the intersection of people,
yes,
and there was challenges about using that data. So how do we balance that out?
Perfect. That's a great question. So one of the ways that we take, or sorry, one of the postures we take from OneTrust, as well as some of the privacy individuals, is that these privacy concerns are both, yes, a point of question of, hey, what are we doing with this data? But these privacy regulations have given us the opportunity to be able to be more transparent with users upfront with how that data is going to be used. So in the example of that futuristic city, it would be important that every individual at least be given the indication, whether it is through CCTV, and they need to be given the indication of what data is being collected, how that data is going to be used, and how that data is going to best serve them. And when you can communicate that to those individuals, those consumers or those users may actually be more inclined to actually use those services, to actually be able to use that information. And the business itself has to be able to present itself as a responsible organization that will continue to use that data for those purposes. And that's where data mapping and record processing comes in.
A similar example was in the ancestry
Yes.
services, right? Where
Yes.
one of them actually admitted they were using it for medical research. And you think about that for society, great medical research, but they didn't get a permission from us to use that, right? So you're saying transparency is required.
Exactly. And it also is an alignment, right? Because one of the common issues we see in industry is that privacy may understand how data is to be leveraged, and then IT or data analytics will go off and do something with that data. Maybe they will use certain customer interactions on a website to feed an ML bot that will then communicate certain products or options to the user. If privacy doesn't have that awareness of that initiative, and instead they now see individuals asking to unsubscribe or asking to have their data removed, then there's a disconnect. What we want to do is we want to change this lack of visibility by having everyone operate and starting those initiatives in the same place.
Let me ask you one more question that came in just in perfect
Certainly.
alignment with what you just said. Now I'll let you get back to the presentation. It said, Phil, how do we get rid of unused, redundant, and untruthful data other than lucky accidents?
Very good question. You have to know what's in there. One of the things that I don't like doing is at the end of the year, I sort of go through my photos and I have to delete the ones that aren't any good, the ones that I don't want to keep, the ones I don't want to share, and make sure that I'm keeping the graduations, the 5K medal races, the ball games with my nephews. I want to keep those. I don't want to keep the receipt photos. I don't want to keep the one sign that I thought was funny for that 1 minute off the side of the highway. So we have to have visibility in that. And so that's where we're going to be able to talk about that more next.
Turn it back over to you.
Awesome, certainly. So there it is. Visibility and validation will be able to help solve for these challenges. So when it comes to these 4 different sections, we have security, we have IT, we have privacy, and each of these different segments or each of these different business functions need to be able to have visibility on all of these items. And it is better when all of these have the same visibility and the same ability to look at that, to be able to look at a data element and know this data element belongs to an employee. This data element belongs to a consumer. This data element belongs to our contractors. What are we supposed to do with this data is now going to be taken by all of these 4 different business functions. So from security, their role may say, hey, we need to know what this data is and just de-risk it. We may want to encrypt it. We want to be able to monitor the controls on the systems for that data. And we want to be able to track what ongoing risks may exist. From the IT perspective, you want to be able to think, okay, if I'm going to store customer data here, let's think about how many customers we have, and let's think about how many times an individual will be giving us data when it pertains to, let's say, their address information, if you're looking at a BDC large-scale shipping or logistics business. You may want to be able to store that data for a certain time period. And then after a certain point, maybe after 2-3 years, you may want to consider, you know what, this person or individual, it does not serve us any additional value to retain this data, especially because of its nature. Let's go ahead and remove or delete that data so that way we are not retaining this information, just so that way we can minimize our surface exposure to cybersecurity threats and so forth. From the privacy perspective, you have the ability to comply with global privacy laws. And one of the interesting things when we think about privacy laws is that they're both a twofold requirement. They, one, enable rights to individuals, but they also enable business to be able to be more transparent with how that data is going to be used. And it also enables business to ask for consent of the individual, which is almost an even better relationship that we see long-term for individuals who are using or respecting consumer rights. If you ever freely give up your information, knowing what type of service you're getting out of it, you end up having a stronger relationship, as opposed to those moments when you hop into a site and suddenly they know everything about you and you just showed up via a targeted ad on Google, or you clicked on a link through Facebook, right? We want to make sure that we are able to clearly communicate to those individuals how their data is being used, and also know that we're doing so where in a way in which where their local privacy laws apply to them. So CPRA, GDPR, HIPAA, a longstanding privacy framework in the US, helps those businesses communicate clearly to those individuals. This is what we're supposed to be doing with your data, and this is how we're staying in line. And then with data governance, right? The data governance perspective on that data is to say, look, if we now have been able to identify and de-risk this information, we've gotten the proper consent of this information, we know that this data long-term may not be here for forever, and therefore once it no longer serves a purpose to us, we can get rid of it. This enables data catalogs to be kept up to date with the relevant information. It streamlines and minimizes the time your stewards are trying to make sense of those siloed tables or those random Excel sheets that may be sitting on network attached storage drives. This will help them be able to keep visibility and track of all of the different data sources, how they are to be used, and then they can enable your analytics divisions. They can enable your data scientists. They can enable your data pipeline engineers to go ahead and use that data and to be able to really extract value out of that business asset. So visibility and validation from these different teams together will end up will end up being the best solution.
So one quick question, and I'm sure we're going to hear this throughout today and tomorrow. What's the impact of generative AI on privacy? Generative AI in some cases generates new data, in other cases it's pulling data down, and is it just another challenge in the the battle between democratization and privacy, or is it going to give us a whole new challenge?
It is. However, one of the things that we see from a market perspective is, and when we're thinking about it, to be able to fuel these AI models, consent has to be given at a certain point, right? One of the interesting things we may not recognize, but ChatGPT, it's built off of the information that was freely available on the web, on the web, right? So whether or not we recognize it, right? If we weren't already aware of what type of information we put out there, it might have picked up an article, and as it relates to you, John, or even I, right? Did we consent to that? Well, we consent to providing our information out there, right? So what typically needs to be a consideration, and one of the things we're even looking at OneTrust, is how do we engage through ethical AI use, right? Ethical AI use is to say, yeah, we may have freely information about an individual online, but should we be using this information, right? And that is sort of the question that we need to be thinking about that. Privacy regulations right now are still developing in this particular phase, but we already know from the get-go, if you're going to do something with data, you gotta have consent.
Let me turn it back over to you. In the meantime, I'm going to search for those receipts that you put online that you forgot to delete. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Absolutely. Awesome. So let's go ahead and talk about what type of architecture may need to exist. And this is where the opportunity for automation and technology is going to help. When it comes to a centralized architecture, we need a central repository, almost like an inventory, as the place in which where the data that is being utilized by the organization can be stored. It can be a data catalog. More than likely, it's going to be a data map. If not, it's going to be your data inventory, in which where you have your assets listed and you're able to detail, hey, what type of data is stored here? How is this data supposed to be used? How does this data impact the broader picture of data use at our organization? And what is the monetization or the value driver for us to use this data? What is the purpose we're using this data in the first place? So that type of repository for many organizations just simply cannot be easily built, and it cannot be a manual initiative. So focused automation helps populate those particular core inventories, so that way you can now plug in your relevant systems. So you can say, okay, let's go ahead and identify within system A what type of data is pertinent to our consumers. let's leverage that automation. And sometimes it could be leveraging automation that uses ML and AI to figure out what kind of data you're using, to then help the business make sense of how you're leveraging it. The next thing we want to do is we want to leverage that same type of automation to help us be able to dictate what controls and security measures we are using in the entire data lifecycle. So being able to understand how data is collected, how data is going to be stored at rest, typically via encryption, and how that data is going to be communicated to different parts of the business or even to third parties. Being able to automate and having a system that will help you grab that relevant information and help individuals report back on the type of security measures that are put in place will only help provide that visibility for those other teams. And then finally, having that same repository integrated with your metadata catalog is going to end up helping enable this further. So that way, everyone has that same type of visibility. You don't have the data scientists bothering data stewards about, hey, can I use this data? Is legal going to bother me about the use of this data for this AI model or not? You already have that visibility because all the necessary teams have already jumped in to be able to provide their feedback and input. So what can you do to get started on this transformation? So this is where we're going to be able to take a look at visibility and control. In order for us to reduce this data risk, we need to be able to discover this data. We need to be able to leverage some type of automation because really the footprint we see for many organizations expands and is forever growing rapidly. And even on a day-to-day basis, you may be adding terabytes of data and not even having the recognition that, hey, this data may serve us a value, it may not, we don't know yet. So discovering that data is going to help. Implementing controls and having those controls being triggered and driven by automation is going to help. Policy orchestration, remediation actions, being able to enable retention policies via that central repository is going to be critical to minimizing your data footprint. A common use case I hear from businesses now is we recognize that this data isn't serving us any value. We just want to get rid of it. The problem is that this data lives in between the valuable data points that we feel like we still can use. Or this privacy regulation is requiring us to remove this data. However, we can't tell the data that the regulation wants us to remove apart from the data that we have the right to hold on to. So being able to implement those controls, again, driven from that discovery capability is going to help. And the best case scenario is going to be to leverage that automation. And then finally, it's the activation of all of these different previously siloed teams as a part of that process. So the initiative sometimes for businesses may take a year, maybe even 3, or for smaller organizations, it may take half a year or a few months. But the goal is we need to be able to start to implement, whether it's a data governance council or the privacy organizations or the data organizations within our businesses, to be able to decide, organize, and then to execute this plan on how you're going to reduce this data risk. And to leverage automation is only going to make that experience a lot easier. So enabling privacy and data business teams to automate compliance activities and to be able to use that data responsibly. One thing that isn't necessarily called out here immediately, but technology that's available now is one of the ways in which your consumers can be a part of this. When it comes to these privacy regulations, your consumers could be the individuals to say, hey, I know that you've previously used my data because I've shopped on Amazon before. I sent you my address and you guys sent me your product. I'm very happy with that. But you know what? I'd like to go ahead and remove that information. Having your consumers at least having an input as a part of this entire process, whether that is through the automation of a data subject access request, where they may request access of their data or deletion of their data, or through opting out of emails. Enabling them to be able to interact with this is going to be a key part of this transformation, because they will oftentimes know a little bit more about what they would like to do with their data as a part of this process. And hey, being able to respect those rights only enables that relationship should they want to come back.
Bill, there's a whole bunch of other questions coming in, but I got to be conscious of time too.
Certainly.
We're gonna run out of time in a few minutes. I just want to let everybody know that questions will be answered afterwards. So please put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to all of them. Bill, I hate to put the pressure on you, but you got about 3 minutes. So
Certainly, yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. So, well, these are some of the key questions, and I'm sure you have more. What data I have? Where is it? What is the purpose for having this data? What is the most impactful fix? Well, the thing to think about is, again, the process that I highlighted before. You want to locate an inventory that's sensitive data. You want to automate remediation. You want to report this progress to your stakeholders. You want to make sure that every individual, executive, key persona is involved as a part of this as a part of this initiative, so that way your organizations can appropriately address the new landscape that we're looking at, DPO 3.0 when it comes to that, or Chief Data Officer 3.0. And then here are some examples. Technical control and validation. You want to be able to detect at-risk data. So being able to discover and identify that data that may be at risk, whether it is specific to the asset or to the application you're storing it in, you want to be able to implement those controls. You want to orchestrate retention. So enabling document retention schedules, enforcing that deletion in those systems automatically. And then data usage requests, enabling those customers and employees to make those usage requests as a result. Some other activities you have when it comes to governance and the processes that automations and discovery will help implement: access and control, data retention, we spoke about that. Maybe masking and encryption. Just de-risking the data may be enough to satisfy some of those regulations. Cloud migration. We can enable cloud migration through the discovery of this data. So for some examples, some customers I've worked with, they now have the ability to say, hey, we can get rid of those older IBM mainframe sources because now we've been able to identify the data relevant to us in the 21st century. And now we can go ahead and begin to bring those services offline. Regulatory compliance can be enabled through this process. And then having a process to manage that unexpected data is also going to be a benefit from this transformation as well. And now finally, if you're looking to hear a little bit more about how OneTrust can help with that entire process, you can visit onetrust.com. You can go ahead and email me. I'm very happy to receive emails and LinkedIn requests from individuals who participate in these sessions. And I'm always happy to go ahead and connect you, whether it is through a resource or a demo as well.